evening. Welcome to the Leader's Edge. And tonight is Season 3, Episode 7. We're going to talk about integrity in organizations, the key to effectiveness and workability. And what you're going to learn from this talk show is you're going to discover how integrity in the design, staffing, and operation of an organization is fundamental to its performance. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Allan Scherr. He's someone who earned his degrees in electrical engineering and computer science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Early in his career in the IBM Corporation, he entered management in the mainframe operating system area. He rose in the management ranks, leading large software projects that, with multiple locations and hundreds of engineers participating, caused him to have responsibilities over the years, which included developing an operating system for a new line of mini computers. He was in IBM's computer network hardware, software, and applications development. And for all of his technical contributions, he was named an IBM Fellow. While at IBM, Dr. Scherr developed a method for improving productivity in engineering groups. In 10 projects, he worked with productivity and has caused the increase of it by over 2.5 times, saving over 50 million US dollars. He also developed a new approach to designing business processes that adds the dimension of accountability to the usual procedure-based approaches. After leaving IBM, he worked at the EMC Corporation, now part of Dell, in the position of Senior Vice President for Software Engineering. In that capacity, he was responsible for a number of storage management products and a group of 200 engineers. After leaving EMC, Dr. Scherr created a management consulting firm specializing in productivity, project management, corporate culture, and software development. Ladies and gentlemen, let's all give a warm Leader's Edge welcome to Dr. Allan Scherr. Allan?
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you for that very generous introduction.
You're very
Shall we
welcome.
shall we get started?
Yes, we should.
Okay. Just a moment. Okay. This morning, it's morning here, but it's evening there. This evening, we're going to be talking about integrity in organization. In my experience, integrity is what enables organizations to produce extraordinary results, and a lack of integrity reduces effectiveness and productivity in the same way. So let me define integrity. This is right out of a U.S. dictionary. Complete, unbroken, whole, entire, unimpaired is probably the definition that I like the best. Perfect condition and soundness. And of course, when people talk about integrity, they also bring in the whole idea of morality, being principled, upright, honest, and sincere. That definition I'm not going to use at the beginning, but you'll see we're going to get to that as we go through this. So let's talk about integrity at three different aspects. First of all, and we're going to use a wheel as the example. So for instance, if you're designing a wheel, you specify the materials you're going to be making the wheel out of and how it's to be put together and what the parts are. At the implementation level, you now have the construction of the wheel. So you put it together as designed with all the pieces. And I call that structural integrity. And then operational integrity is that the thing works as designed. It's easier to see what I'm talking about if you look at it from the other point of view, which is what happens when it's not done well. So for instance, designing a wheel that's not round is a flaw, is a lack of integrity given the purpose of a wheel. Structural integrity is missing if a part's missing. And operational integrity is missing if, for instance, one of the parts fails,
Mm.
doesn't operate as intended. So those are the three levels. And now what I'm going to do is apply this idea of the three aspects of integrity to organizations. So if you look at an organization from a design point of view, uh, part of the organizational design, of course, is the reporting structure, the job descriptions, the authorities and responsibilities or accountabilities that each person in the organization has. Um, what I've shown here is a simple manufacturing, sales, engineering organization with sales divided into regions, Northeast, Southeast, and West. So that's part of what an organizational design is. Another part of the business processes. So for instance, a customer places an order and the order is fulfilled by manufacturing. Uh, let's say it's a build to order kind of a process. Or sales needs a new product, they go to engineering, engineering designs the product, works with manufacturing to produce it, and then makes it available to sales. Or for instance, the customer needs service and then goes to the service group who may in fact have to consult engineering to solve customer problems. By the way, one of the examples or one of the things in my experience is that things fall through the cracks in organizations, and the cracks generally are the interfaces between organizations. And so one of the things that I always did in my organizations was create a manager of everything else. So I would actually do it to 2 or 3 people and say, your responsibility is anything that might fall through the cracks. Corporate culture obviously is part of this, the way we do things around here. And then also what things are expected. And we'll talk about expectations in a few minutes. At the structural integrity level, the design is implemented. So from an organizational point of view, that means that the necessary resources are provided and the positions are adequately staffed with the required skills. Um, Either one of those things being short of what was needed in the design obviously creates an integrity problem. And then finally, an operational integrity, it's doing what's expected. But a necessary condition is that individuals and groups of individuals do what's expected. And you'll see, I'll elaborate on that as we go along. And then finally, about expectations, doing what other people expect is the basis of individual integrity. Again, you'll see how we get to that in a few minutes. So obviously a formula for success is meeting expectations. Whose expectations, you might ask? So first of all, customers. My favorite example is, when you have a customer service line, customers expect service when they call without knowing anything else about the organization they're talking to. So customers have expectations about the products you're providing or services, given the advertising that you do, and so on. So management has expectations of the employees, of their management. Employees have expectations of that they're going to be taken care of in a certain way by the company and paid, and used, and the assignments that they have are going to be given in a certain way, and so on. Suppliers obviously have expectations. The government has requirements and expectations. The public, the owners or shareholders of the company or the organization, and there are other stakeholders as well.
Alan, if I may interrupt briefly, I was just
Sure.
wondering because you spoke about how there would be like a manager for everything who would catch whatever slips through the cracks. But one of the things that initially prompted a thought in my mind when I was listening to you is a question like, how can we simulate a test for structural integrity for organizations in a way that accounts for culture and the market they need to be in?
Well, my answer to that is that you really need to ask the various stakeholders, the people who on this list, uh, what their experience is of the operation of the organization. So, you know, for instance, customer complaints or customer interactions with service, customer interactions with sales, trying to find out what worked for them and what didn't work for them, and doing the same thing at all these levels. What you find out is what worked really well and what didn't work so well, and you can work on the thing. You can work to improve what didn't work well, and use what worked very well uh, as a guide to improving other places.
Mm. So it seems that despite the truthfulness of the value of getting feedback from customers, um, what I'm hearing is that a lot of organizations don't really pay enough attention to what their customers are saying.
Yes, I'll give you an example. I mean, I manage customer service groups in engineering, that were like the third level. And in other words, the customer would call the service department, and the service department, if they couldn't handle it, would go to an expert. And then if the expert couldn't handle it, it would come to engineering. So I was on the third level. I had people working for me on the third level.
Mm.
The reports that they fill out for every incident often never get read again. And as a consultant, I worked with a number of companies where they had this huge database of information from customer calls to service and never looked at them.
Oh,
Uh,
great.
or what they did look at were what are called closing codes. In other words, how did you close the call? And I'll give you one example, which is a customer calls up and has a problem with the way your product works. And the service person hears that and says, but that's the way the product was designed to work. So the closing code would be works as designed. That's an actual closing code at IBM, or was. You know,
And
you
I
know, if
suppose,
you,
yeah,
sorry.
sorry. So I suppose what sometimes that does is it causes the customer bringing a legitimate concern to feel kind of dumb because the product is working the way it's supposed to, and yet they have a complaint about it. So
Yes, and the engineer says, "Oh, okay, they didn't understand how it worked," and they leave it at that. Whereas on the other hand, it could be a gold mine of information about usability issues, about functions that are missing from the product, a whole raft of possibilities that are not seen because people don't look at that kind of data from that point of view,
mm,
starting with the person that answers the phone in customer service.
absolutely. I recall the first time electric cars came out, the first few users were baffled with how to use those charging stations and where does this thing go and how do I get this machine to work, and a lot of frustrations and hurt feelings all around when it was
Yeah.
in its nascent stage.
Yeah, for me, again, I was in the software business, or computer product business, and for me, the customer service calls were a great source of information about usability issues of the product, both
Mm.
functional and efficiency in terms of having customers quickly learn how to use our products and not make errors and get the job done quickly. And I think that point of view is often missing in companies I've talked
Oh, that's a good insight because what I'm getting from you is somehow the loss of intuitiveness the use of a product, it should be user friendly or customer
Yeah.
friendly.
Well, I mean, okay. In the 1960s, I worked on a command system for an interactive system, and one of the people that I worked with said the way this interactive system should work with people is based on a principle which I've created, and he called it the principle of least surprise or
Oh,
of least astonishment. So whatever the system does should be the least astonishing thing you can think of, as
mhm.
opposed to surprising users. Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but one of the things I have worked on is usability of software, and in my opinion, it's abominable these days.
All right. Do go on, because now we're looking at the aspect of customer service, and I'm with you in that there's a gold mine in there for
Yes,
product development and improvement.
absolutely. Okay, so meeting expectations is the formula for success. Where do these expectations come from? Well, first of all, it's what's been promised to be done and by when. It's what the people's job descriptions in the organization and the roles they play in the business processes. It's product descriptions and advertising and claims made about products. It's, if you're talking about sports, it's the play that that's been called. So in American football, the quarterback calls a play, and everybody knows or should know exactly what they're supposed to do, which way they run, which way they move, and everybody expects each player to do the part that's called for. In a business, there's a plan, an agreed to plan, and a strategy. So people, if it's agreed to, people expect the players in the company to adhere to it. What was expected of a predecessor. So for instance, if you're a salesman and you just took over an account, uh, you should be aware of what your predecessor promised to be done and by when, so that you can take over. Otherwise, you're going to wind up with a problem. And then there's the culture of the organization, including, again, the protocols we talked about, the way we do things around here. And then finally, what's considered ethical, moral, and legal. In most cultures, in most countries, in most situations, the expectation is that you're not going to break the law, that you'll tell the truth, and that you'll be ethical. So that's where all of that comes in, because it's what people expect, unless you're a criminal.
Right.
So let's talk about expectations. It's something people wait for, or it's what they look for is likely to appear. They look forward to it, anticipate it. And the third definition is probably the most powerful. It's what people see as what's due, proper, or necessary.
Mm.
That's what expect means. And obviously it also means to be expecting a baby, but we're not going to use that definition. What can distort expectations? So first thing is unintended ambiguities in communication. For instance, in some countries, when you say yes, it doesn't necessarily mean you agree. In some countries, it just means I heard you. And for instance, in Japan, hi means more like I heard you than I agree. And so I've seen a number of misunderstandings based on people saying yes when meaning I heard you and not meaning I agree with what you said. And so agreements get messed up that way. I'll tell a joke that kind of makes the point. A young executive was leaving the office late one night, and he spotted the CEO standing in front of a shredder with a piece of paper in his hand. And the CEO says, this is a very sensitive and important document, and I need to get this machine to work. How do you get it to work? Can you help me? And the young executive says, sure. And he takes the piece of paper and he turns the machine on, inserts the paper, presses the button. And as the piece of paper is being shredded, the CEO says, excellent. I just need one copy of that paper.
Oh, good grief. Oh man, he's going to
So
use up.
there's an unintended ambiguity.
Yeah.
So it all boils down to differences in recollection. I don't remember you saying that. I don't, the language, as I spoke, and culture, ethics, morals, and legal system. So all of that can make for unintended ambiguities. The next one is intended ambiguity. So people making promises that aren't promises. I'll do my best. And so when they don't get it done, they have an excuse. Or people saying, this product will do this, and the product specifications are vague enough so that when it doesn't do what a customer thought it would do, you're off the hook.
Oh, yeah.
This happens in the political arena as well.
Mm.
The example I have is that after the Six-Day War in 1967, the UN Security Council passed a resolution called Resolution 242, if you want to look it up, which said, quote, withdrawal of the Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict will occur. The wording is ambiguous. Does it mean some of the territories or all of the territories? In some ways, it was best not to ask, since the phrasing was palatable to both Israel and its allies, and also the Arab countries. But now 40, 50, 60 years later, people are still arguing about what it means. So it was an agreement in a sense, because people could say there was an agreement, but the fact is the conflict was not resolved and obviously exists today. So
I'd like to react to that, Alan, if you don't
sure.
mind. You've raised a very, very important point. Some of the laws that we go through every day, whether state law or federal law, can sometimes be so ambiguous as to be a reason why lawyers have so much work to do trying to
Yes.
figure those things out. But having been talking about integrity in organization, some organizations just aren't as well designed as they're meant to be, or they may be designed but are dysfunctional. How would you attribute the success of Apple anyway? Was it all because of Steve Jobs, or was it because he had a great team? Was it design, or was it personality that helped Apple do so well?
Well, I never worked for Apple, but I've read all the books. But my opinion is that the reason the Apple products did so well and are doing so well is because one person, Steve Jobs, was the one who had final say on every part of the way the products looked and operated and how they were used. So he was the usability czar, if you will, of all of that. And so the Apple products during his reign, so to speak, were much easier to use, much simpler, much less astonishing in the way they worked than the competition. In terms of his being an executive who developed leaders in his organization or who dealt with people in a way that really worked, I don't think Mr. Jobs qualified in that regard. So my interpretation of why they were successful was he was a great product designer, and he made his will. He imposed his will on all the products. There's an old joke in engineering that a horse designed by a committee is a camel. And so in many respects, the competition to the Apple products were camels. Mm-hmm. And Jobs made his products into horses.
I love your take on that because um, some of the most iconic cars that we enjoy today were the vision of, say, the owners of the company, like the Pagani Zonda, or the Ferraris that we see on the road. They're
Yeah,
beautiful, they're lovely, but my guess is it's because one man with one vision made that happen, drove that, rather than, say, taking a committee to weigh in, the accountants,
yes,
the engineers, and then it wouldn't look like anything that's desirable, but rather it might turn out to be something that's beige or
yes.
totally
No, I
boring.
agree with you.
Hmm.
I mean, my opinion is that, and this is a pretty specific area of engineering, is if you're going to have if you're doing a product that has user interfaces, or a car, or something like a car that's meant for usage by actual people, you want to have one person in charge of the way it looks or the
Hmm.
way it operates in terms of user interfaces, and that way at least it's consistent, as opposed to a Camel. And I'm not going to say what brand of car my wife has, but I use her car as an example of a poorly designed interface. It's got buttons on the steering wheel. It's got buttons on the console, and it's got buttons on the display. And the number of buttons is over 25, and it's got four um, knobs to turn, some of which you can push as another button. And some of the buttons work for some of the functions, and some of the buttons work for other functions. And you don't know which is which because you're just a human being.
if, if you're moving at 75 miles per hour at the interstate, that's a terrible time to work on your learning curve with
That's right.
those many buttons. Oh
Yeah,
my.
it's very distracting. I mean, and anyway, that's um, we're getting a little far afield here, but the fact is that it gets it's an ambiguity that
Yeah.
people have to deal with.
But let's
Yeah,
let's take it back to IBM, because there's one thing that's really astonished me about IBM over the years, and that is how IBM led the sales in terms of PCs, or personal computers, were Apple, I suppose, because they got so stingy with their OS, and really just tried to go for a niche, weren't quite as mass used as IBM computers were. Uh, to
that's
what
right.
would to what would you attribute that to? Would that be because of the design integrity that went into uh, putting together a mass market personal computer?
Well, the in the early '80s, when IBM did the PC, Apple products and some of the other so-called personal computers were seen by business as basically toys. Um, they weren't, they didn't take them seriously. The TRS-80, which was Radio Shack's computer,
I remember that.
in fact, the IBM people called it the Trash 80. Uh, the the there was a thing that IBM customers used to say, which is nobody ever got fired for buying IBM.
Right.
Uh, and so when IBM came out with a personal computer, never mind what the design was, but the fact is that people said, "Gee, IBM's doing this; it must be good. It
Right.
must work. It must be usable."
Mm.
And it took off in business, after a relatively short period of time, because it had the IBM seal of approval, so to speak.
That's true.
Um, we'll talk more about the opportunity that IBM had created for the PC with the PC at the end of this, because
Okay.
it's a good example of integrity or the lack thereof.
Mm.
So anyway, finally, we can talk about distorting expectations by deliberate deception, and of course, some companies actually do that, but we're not going to dwell on that because it's not only illegal, but it also doesn't work.
Yep.
So let's talk. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm with you there because um, it's better to build on somebody's strengths than on somebody's weaknesses. So
Yes.
do go on.
Okay. So in an organization, communication, if you will, is between individuals. So expectations are created between these individuals through conversations. And expectations met is a matter of individuals honoring their word, and I'll talk about what that means. There's a long article by that I have cited at the bottom of the page that basically defines honoring your word as meaning either keeping your word, or if not, being responsible for cleaning up the mess that you create when you haven't kept your word. And so this basically is about having people in the organization be serious about their word. In other words, that just because they can't do what they said they were going to do doesn't let them off the hook. By the way, in some organizations, people seem to want to avoid giving their word or make pseudo promises by being ambiguous. And by the way, it doesn't go unnoticed, but people who never give their word are practically useless. So, and as soon as you give your word, you're taking a risk that you won't be able to do it. And so basically, not being able to keep your word is something that occurs naturally, all the time. And being responsible for cleaning up whatever mess you've made is something that is required in order to have integrity.
I'd like to,
Go ahead.
sorry, I'd like to react to that because we do know that there is one company that made so much effort to market their products and try to be the first one out there with their electric cars. And we know that um, when they promised the Model 3 would come out when it was supposed to, and it didn't. And yet, the fallout from it was very small. People remained loyal. It's still considered the car that represents EVs. And that's awesome. How did Elon Musk manage to get through that mess?
I think by honoring, they made a promise, in
Mhm.
effect, that they would deliver the Model 3 by a certain date, and they were unable to fulfill that.
Right.
And what happened was, first of all, Tesla acknowledged that they missed the date, and they tried to clean up the mess. They compensated some people. They took actions that were intended to mitigate the problem that they had created.
Yeah.
And I think that's why Tesla wound up being well thought of all the way through this, even though they missed that date.
Hmm. So in
So
other words, uh,
I
the
was going to say,
willingness to,
go
to
ahead.
own up is so important for public perception.
Yes, absolutely. And, owning up to problems, owning up to errors, uh, as embarrassing as it may seem, is a very powerful thing to do. And, people that never own up to their mistakes or their failures don't get very far,
True. Um,
usually.
the Japanese are very fastidious about keeping their word.
Here's the thing: if you never fail to keep your word, in other words, if you always keep your word, I would say you're playing too small a game. In other
Right.
words,
Yeah.
it means you're not near the edge, so to speak.
Mm.
And the good thing about failing is that you get a sense of where your limits are.
Hmm. Audacity does favor those who are prepared, and so
Yes,
planning and integrity are critical.
yes, absolutely.
Do go on, Alan.
Okay, so individual integrity is honoring one's word. Uh, what your word is what you said you would do or not do, what you know to do or not do, and doing it the way you know it's meant to be done. Uh, what one is expected to do or not do, unless you've managed those expectations and said to the contrary, or something like, I know what you expected me, but this is what I'm really going to do. That's managing expectations. And what you say is so. In other words, standing behind what you express as a fact, as opposed to, or if you're giving your opinion, then you say it as an opinion, which means it's an uncommitted speech act. Opinions are not facts. And of course, in our culture, at least in the United States, there's a great deal of confusion between what's really a fact and what's simply an opinion. And people, for the most part, don't honor their own word when they say something is so. Okay, let me give you an example of an organization with integrity and one that lost integrity and what happened. This is an IBM example. IBM engineering in the 60s and 70s. It was run by a guy named Bob Evans, who, by the way, is my hero. He was the best engineering executive that ever walked the planet, in my opinion.
Okay. I'll be sure to
Um,
look him up. Yeah.
he's pretty great guy. IBM in the 60s created a brand new line of computers that superseded every computer they'd done before. It was done in 20 locations worldwide with thousands of people. There were manufacturing plants all throughout the US, Europe, and Japan. There were engineering groups worldwide in Europe, in the United States, Canada, and in Japan. And there were huge numbers of interdependencies between these things because, tape units were done in Boulder, Colorado, and they had to work with device controllers that were built in Poughkeepsie, New York, and so on. So the people depended on each other to get their products to work. There was a high degree of operational integrity, mainly because of Bob Evans. He insisted that people give their word to do things by a certain date, and he insisted that people operate according to those agreements. And if they couldn't do it, they had to own up to it and accept help from others and make it happen. And that's what happened in the 60s and in the 70s. I was running a very large software project in the early 70s, and we needed some work to be done. And we added the 12th location to the project and the 20th group and didn't think anything of it. The lowest common management that we had with this 20th group was the CEO of IBM, because it was a group that was in a completely different business unit. And it worked because people gave their word and then honored their word. Okay, so let's move. And one other thing, multi-location projects were the norm because of the way IBM was organized. In the 80s, on the other hand, Evans had moved on. Multiple location projects were avoided. As a matter of fact, in one example, two groups in the same building wouldn't work together. A number of multi-location projects had failed or were failing. Interlocation dependencies had become very unreliable, and new products were often engineered to eliminate dependencies on other groups. And unavoidable dependencies were serialized. What I mean by that is, if I needed another location to do something, I would wait for them to do it, and then I would build the product that depended on it. So obviously the development times for products was extended because of this culture. When the
Say, Alan,
personal,
if I may, sorry for interrupting.
okay,
Um, you brought up a very interesting point there, because if IBM was massively global, and with thousands of people, of course, different nationalities, different cultures, there must have been a huge obstacle in terms of how to avoid ambiguity, because, as you said, in some places, the height, which is a yes, really meant I simply heard you rather than I agree
no,
with
you're
you.
right. Well, here, see this?
Oh, okay.
This is a product spec for one of the
Holy
projects.
God. Yeah, I can imagine, Alan, that you must have created like a jargon or a language just to somehow make sure everybody was talking about the same
That's
thing.
right. Yes. Okay. So I think that there was at least one thing that was done that made a huge difference, and that was um, the whole thing was managed centrally.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
so, and maybe you have to put air quotes around the word managed. So, for instance, there was a group in, turns out, Poughkeepsie, New York,
Hmm.
that coordinated everything. And so, if I was in a group that was doing a part, and I needed another group in another location um, to do something, I needed to get that dependency, that and the commitment for that dependency registered with the group in Poughkeepsie.
Hmm.
So they were the group in Poughkeepsie were kind of the brokers that managed all the dependencies, and they were the ones that made sure they were met. If I just called up the other group, and made some kind of side agreement, it was not enforced.
Okay.
So part of it was, instead of having, if you have 20 groups and
Mhm.
you have every pair of groups talking to one another, it's a huge number of conversations.
Yes.
Instead, what we did was, we had 20 groups talking through a central group. So instead of 20 things taken two at a time, which is a big number, you have 20 conversations or 21 conversations instead, and it's much simpler to manage. So instead of going up exponentially as you add groups, the number of conversations went up linearly.
So, Alan, that raises an interesting point, because during the 70s and the early 80s, I'm fairly sure that video conferencing was either it's in its infancy, or maybe
Yes.
not existing yet. How do you figure out who was talking? If it's just a teleconference, like over the phone.
Well, IBM had teleconferencing back then. They had rooms in every location from which you could do conferences, and we did a lot of traveling.
Oh,
I,
okay.
I would visit locations frequently. Um,
Oh, so you racked up
so,
your frequent flyer miles.
oh yeah, I probably on the road. Uh, it depends on the phase of the product, but
Mm.
either people would come to me or I would go to them.
Wow.
But there was a lot of travel going on, and in some cases, video conferencing.
Oh, there
Um,
was video conference at that time already.
yes, but they were like TV studios. They were very large, expensive operations, and a location with 10,000 employees might have one room like that.
What sort of latency occurred during those times? Like these days with Zoom, like we're having this conversation and there's hardly any delay. But back then, it must have been. It must
Yeah,
have
it
been.
was. I mean, the most of those uh, facilities were done using satellites for communication. And of course, with a satellite, the distances are so long that there's a 2 or 3 second delay that you had to deal with, which is why satellite telephones never really worked.
Hmm. That's
But
right.
IBM pioneered. In fact, Evans was involved. IBM pioneered satellite communications back in the early '80s.
Hmm.
Okay, can we get back to this?
Yeah, please do. Sorry.
Okay. So the IBM personal computer. I was on the corporate technology staff in the early '80s, and one of my jobs was to oversee the personal computer engineering project. So I'm pretty familiar with what they did, what their attitudes were, because I visited them and talked to them over the period of time when they were developing it. And they were adamant that they did not want to depend on any other group than IBM for the reasons that they were undependable. So for instance, they went outside for operating system software, ultimately to Bill Gates, and they went outside for processor chips and memory chips to Intel. And even though IBM had, at that time, had the largest chip foundry in the world, and also had at least 2 operating systems that were better than what PC-DOS turned out to be inside the company. They just didn't want to deal with the IBM groups that had. So even though there was as good or better technology within IBM, they went outside.
Hmm.
And for a variety of reasons, never brought it inside. And as a result, if you look at the market capitalization of Intel and Microsoft, it's basically 2 points. When I did this chart, it was 2.7 times IBM. So in other words, the total value of IBM stock was exceeded by 2.7 by the total value of Intel and Microsoft stock. So they gave away 2.7 IBM worth of value by doing this. And if this had been a project in the '60s or the '70s, that never would have happened.
So you're saying
Go ahead.
the integrity issue entered the picture, and obviously trust issues as well, because
Of course, yes.
yeah, if you had like hundreds of people, say working on an OS or programmers, brilliant programmers doing great work, and then you had your own chip manufacturing division, and yet, as you said, the company went outside to get those things.
Yep.
There must have been tremendous losses, more than just in terms of money, but could it be morale was also affected because of some of the design integrity issues?
I think absolutely. I mean, I worked IBM in the same period had 6 lines of mini computers, 6,
Wow.
and there was a project to supersede all 6 with 1. And I was one of the engineering managers on that project. Even though all the groups responsible reported to the same IBM executive that I did, we couldn't get it to work.
Oh my God.
And you know, the of the 6, 2 got together. They happened to be in the same building, and created a product called AS400. But the rest of the other 4 systems basically either died on the vine,
Oh, okay.
or over years, or basically were superseded by other products.
You know, one of the
So
great successes that IBM made is if I recall, the name of it is the AS400.
well,
That
that's
actually,
the product I'm talking about. The
yeah.
AS400 was done in Rochester, Minnesota,
Mm.
and it was the combination of the System 38 and the System 32, I believe.
Yeah. I have some friends who are still working with it, and they're still using COBOL with that. Um, and
Yes.
I had the chance to actually meet the developer of COBOL. That's Admiral Grace Hopper during one of
Oh,
the conventions of the Toastmasters. I met her when she was still alive,
yeah.
and it just amazes me that she. I guess Grace was not part of IBM, right? Or was she a
No.
consultant brought in to write the language for the hardware?
Yeah, well, I don't know that she wrote a lot of the compiler to compile the language, but she was certainly in on the beginning of the definition of COBOL, which
Oh,
stands for Common Business-Oriented Language, by the
yeah,
way.
yeah.
I actually met her as well in late 70s when I got the ACM, which is computer uh, organization, the Association for Computing Machinery. It's what it stands for. It's
Mm.
like the IEEE, but for computers. And I won the Grace Murray Hopper Award, and so I met her.
Wow. Yeah.
She was quite a character.
Yeah, she is. Yes, she was. Yes. I like the way that she demonstrated her concept of computer languages, and she had this string that she always brought with her to demonstrate her point. And so um, I miss her now that she's no longer around, but her
Yes.
impact is certainly still felt.
Yes.
COBOL is a wonderful language.
And it's fairly easy to use.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could talk about computer
Yeah.
uh, science for a long time. It's
Yeah, I know.
one of my hot buttons. So
Okay.
let's continue with this.
All right.
So let's just to review 3 aspects of organizational integrity: business processes, role definition, authority, responsibility structures, and the culture required to fulfill expectations are present. That's what we call organizational design integrity.
Mm.
Structural integrity is there's adequate resources and staff with the right skills, and might I say the right attitude are provided. And finally, operational integrity, that the staff members and resources perform as expected. So that's what I mean by organizational integrity. Integrity is honoring one's word. It inspires trust. It allows people to depend on other people, or groups to depend on other people, or customers to depend on the companies they do business with, and so on. It enables workability. Workability enables efficiency, and workability enables maximum performance for organizations and individuals. This presentation is really just the tip of the iceberg. We train organizations in clear communication of commitment, which is not as simple as it sounds. When I first was exposed to those concepts, I couldn't sit in meetings because I would hear people make what turned out to be pseudo commitments, if you will. I'll try, or they'd say what they were going to do, but wouldn't say by when, that kind of stuff.
Mm.
Business process design is another area that we work in, and also dealing with the inevitable setbacks and breakdowns that occur when extraordinary results are being pursued. Anyway, organizational integrity is the foundation. And by the way, it starts at the top. If integrity is missing at the top of an organization, no matter what you do below that, it'll disappear.
Mm.
So, and one of the clients I had designed a T-shirt, which I'll show you, and I'll end with that, which is, without integrity, nothing works. It's not quite an accurate statement. I mean, things work to the extent that there is integrity, and to that extent, things work. But I like the four words certainly say it. So the 4 words say it in a way that's that makes the point very strongly, I think.
Mm.
So, do you have any more questions?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I do. Uh, some organizations um, adopt what they call political correctness. I guess this came out during the how was it, early 21st century, where you couldn't call somebody obese anymore because then you'd be called body shaming. So you had to say stout or horizontally enhanced or vertically challenged. Um, and because of this tiptoeing around, um, ambiguity must have also occurred because you're right when you say people will tell you I'll try, I'll do my best. uh, we can't work with that because there are deadlines. And I remember in the computer industry, one mantra is always on time, on cost, on quality, no excuses. Right. So uh,
Yep.
how
Well, go ahead.
yeah, so how do we how do we uh, how do we make people conform to this need for integrity, um, without ruffling too many feathers? Because we need driven people, we need committed
Yeah, of
people, we
course.
need people who will honor their word, as you said.
That's
um,
right. Well, I think so I think there are two things. One is to have people get very clear
hmm,
and therefore what is not a commitment. And so, for instance, a promise, if I make you a promise, that is two parts. It has what the conditions are that I'm going to satisfy,
right.
by when. And there was some work done by a man named Fernando Flores back in the 60s that
Hmm.
looked at productivity in business. And what he focused on were meetings. And he said, well, obviously you can tell what the productivity would be results per unit of time or per unit of work. So in a meeting, you know exactly what the cost is,
Right.
but the real question is, well, what's the productive output?
Ah.
So he did a PhD thesis at Berkeley, University of California in Berkeley, and his conclusion was that what the productive output of a meeting is commitments,
Hmm.
and everything else he called BS, and he used that as a technical term, by the
Yeah,
way.
you're
So
right, because the deliverables are really what matters.
right. So if you like, we can do another presentation on what his work was. But when I found out about this and spent some time with it, I had trouble sitting in meetings
Oh,
because everybody, people would avoid making commitments. They would say what they were going to do, but not by when, or they would say by when, but not what they were going to do, or they would say I'll try or I'll do my best, or people would people did not want to be responsible for what they were saying. Let's put it that way.
true. Hey, Alan, was it during your time when what was called corridor meetings came to pass? Like people would no longer be sitting in meeting rooms, but they just gather somewhere and walk together and make meetings
Well,
shorter, faster.
I mean that always happened. I mean, I think of a of an incident that occurred that made a big difference in my career. That was standing at a coffee machine,
All right.
and I had a terrible problem, and with the project that I was managing, and one of the programmers of the group that had the problem came up to me and said, "If you tell my manager to leave me alone, I'll fix the problem in time." It was a time frame that he had to do it in.
Yeah.
This was in the 70s, so it was a long time ago. I still remember the programmer's name because he saved my butt. His name was Dave Brush. and he wound up doing it. But the point is that um, he told his boss, his immediate manager, that he would fix the problem, and instead of taking his commitment on as face value, he started grilling him about how he was going to do it. And Dave told the guy, "I'm not sure how I'm going to do it, but I know I can do it." And in terms of, and this person I knew was capable of doing it if he said he was going to do it. And so
Right.
and besides, I was desperate. So, so yeah. So I mean, they used to call it management by walking around.
Yeah. True.
So I used to walk around the area where I worked a lot. So I was pretty accessible to the people that worked for me. It's interesting because one of the things that people do with the boss is they'll ask questions, and then whatever the boss says, they'll do, which lets them off the hook.
Right.
So if somebody asks me what to do, I'll say, okay, I'm going to give you some ideas, but it's your responsibility to figure out which idea to use. Don't do this because I said so. Do it because it'll work. And if you don't think it'll work, do something else. So people, my management style is to make sure that the people who worked for me were responsible and accountable for what they were saying they were going to do. And it was their decisions about how to do things, not necessarily mine. Now, obviously, there are limitations in every direction, but by and large, people needed to be responsible for the choices they made and not have an out that says, oh, the big boss said to do it this way. And by the way, I discovered that a lot more of my ideas actually got used when I operated that way than when I just told people what to do.
Oh, oh, that's serendipitous because when something performs better than what you initially thought it would, that gives a kind of satisfaction that you seldom get
That's right.
from other things. Yeah. So, Alan, before we end our episode tonight, um, is there one message that you'd like to add about integrity in design that you feel might help the world now, especially because of this pandemic? Um, how valuable is integrity in this pandemic now?
Well, I think it's essential. I mean, it really the T-shirt that says nothing works without integrity
True.
is really the message. I mean, it's which involves clear communication so that people's expectations are managed. It involves making real commitments that people can depend on, so that their actions don't have to always be looking over your shoulder to see, if you're still, if you're still being supported in the way you expected. It involves telling the truth, and being transparent. And so, and that has, in the United States at least, has been missing. And I think the new regime in the United States, so far at least, has gone in the opposite direction. They're doing regular briefings on a daily basis in some cases, and they seem to be being honest, and they're not sugarcoating anything. They're not, they're telling it, I think, like it is. We'll see, right? But
Yeah.
so far, I'm optimistic. Let's put it that way. I think we're on the right track. But regardless, we know what's going on now, where before we didn't.
Yes.
I watched the news program last night where the news person was amazed that the new Biden administration is actually having press briefings every day, where the prior administration didn't have press briefings for weeks at a time, maybe months at a time, and never took real questions.
That sounds very, very familiar to me, but yeah, but in a different context.
No, I understand. Communication is essential. Clear communication is the basis of integrity. If you know what I'm promising you, we had an agreement that I would get on this at 9 o'clock this morning, my time.
Yeah,
And I kept you, and that's what you expected, and that's what I delivered.
that's right.
If we were in a different culture, and you said 9-ish, or I'll talk to you tomorrow. What that creates is an immense amount of inefficiency.
Yes.
Because it creates uncertainty. And the uncertainty breeds inefficiency. Uncertainty breeds redundancy. Because if I'm uncertain of what you're going to do, I'll see if I can do it myself.
Right.
And so the idea is that you want to be able to depend on the people on your team. And which brings up the next topic, which is what is a team? For me, a team is a group of people that have common commitments.
Yes.
So, for instance, you look at a sports team, and the ones that win games typically have a group commitment to winning the game. And if there's one person on the team that doesn't have that commitment, rather maybe has a commitment to looking good or scoring more points or whatever, it's obvious. So, there are sports teams that have, showboats, or, there's a stars, and they want to look like a star. And so what they do is they will take every opportunity to shine at the expense of their team score or their team work. So the idea is a team has common commitments, and if you have somebody that's a narcissist or an egotist or somebody that's more interested in their own agenda than the team, that they will stand out, and they in the negative way rather.
Sure.
What I've seen is that on projects that take time as opposed to a 2-hour game, having common commitments has to include the commitments of the individuals that are on the team. So, for instance, if a woman is pregnant and she wants to take time off when she has her child, that needs to be part of the team's commitment, that's going to be fine. Or somebody is taking a course on Thursday nights and can't, and by the way, one of the more common commitments I've seen with teams in engineering anyway is a commitment not to work more than 10 hours a day, 5 days a week.
Oh.
So, and obviously there are engineers that don't mind doing that.
Yes.
But my experience is that productivity and creativity suffer from those long hours. And so a lot of the groups I've managed, we had a rule that at 6 o'clock, everybody's got to be gone. 6 p.m.
That's what's called the law of diminishing returns. When
Absolutely.
You're just so exhausted, there's nothing that you can squeeze out of a rock anymore.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and the biggest problem with engineering exhaustion, if you want to call it that, is that they create bugs, problems, errors, and the errors cost way more to fix once they're out in the field with customers than they would ever cost to avoid or to fix before you ship the product.
That's right. Product recalls often cost millions, sometimes even more.
Hundreds, yeah, I mean, exactly. So it's really a lot of I call them death marches in engineering. I mean, they basically will work 100 hours a week getting a project out. At the end of the project, everybody's burned out. They've made tons of errors.
Yes.
And but the project's done on time, sort of, you
Mhm.
know.
I love what you're saying there, because you're in effect saying, it's not about working harder, it's working smarter,
Absolutely.
working with a plan, with a design,
And the
one that has integrity at its core.
Yes, and exactly. And when you introduced me, you talked about these projects we did in IBM where we improved productivity by a factor of 2.5, 2.6. By the way, that number was audited by the controller of IBM, so it's not BS.
Yeah, right.
Uh, but the way we did it was we set goals that were so high that
Mm,
you couldn't get there by just working extra hours.
mm,
So you had to figure out how to work smarter.
right.
You
And
know,
so at this point, I'd like to say that a lot of what you've shared with us today was very resonant and very well endorsed by Robert Walker, who was one of our guests in an earlier episode. And I can tell that the two of you walk your talk, because the impact of your ideas have really changed the corporate landscape, not just there in America, but pretty much in the rest of the world, because best practices are often repeated when it works.
yes.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
it's a,
Alan, if I may, I just like to thank you in behalf of our audience here at the Leader's Edge. We really have enjoyed and learned so much from you, and I do hope we can count on you to be our guest again in the future, where we can talk about other things that also contribute to integrity. At this point, I'd like to just invite our audience to remember that coming up next in episode 8, season 3, is what we call Asia CEO Events, where our guest will be Rebecca Bustamante, and the host for that show will be Dinah Loomis. So, ladies and gentlemen, remember that learning is a never ending journey with limitless vistas. Good night. Alan, thank you so much. Good night. And from the Philippines, mabuhay.
thank you.